I get the privilege of introducing our speaker for this morning. Last week, you got to hear from our friend Emmanuel Ngulu. And then this morning, we get to hear from the lead pastor and executive director of the Sacred Grace, our family of churches, Jared Mackey. In some ways, he needs no introduction, so I'll probably just leave it at that and let him tell you anything else about himself that he would like to. But I highly recommend getting some time with Jared at some point if you have the opportunity. He's definitely open to that. So if you would please give Jared Mackey a warm Inglewood welcome. Thank you.
All right. Good morning. It's lovely to see you. For those of you who are here in the parking lot, and for those of you who are listening online, it's nice to be with you this morning. Eugene Peterson writes this: suffering is a mystery. We come to respect the mystery. But in the midst of suffering, Job has found himself in a larger mystery, which is the mystery of God. So I'd like to begin today with, if you are here listening in person or online or maybe later this week to the podcast, and you have questions about God, you have questions about the church, my hope is that you would hear a humility about who we are and what we can know about the mystery of suffering and this larger mystery, which is the mystery of God. Our mission as a family of churches is to lead people into an integrated life, a life of following the way of Jesus. And one way we live an integrated life is to acknowledge the questions that we all have, to not pretend that we do not have any questions ourselves. So if you are here today or listening to this later and you are unsure, can I have all of my questions and still belong to this kind of church and this family of churches? I would say a wholehearted yes. And the reason is because I show up here this morning with my questions and all the rest of us show up with our questions. And so you are invited to show up here with yours. What brings us together, this magnet in the middle, is a desire. And it's a desire to follow the way of Jesus, to grow up towards the Father, in towards ourselves and each other, and out towards the neighbors and the neighborhoods around us. And so thank you for being here today. The teaching text that we're going to look at today is in the book of Job, and it's Job's chapter 38, 39, 40, and 41. After 37 maybe exhausting chapters of questions and accusations and conjecture about a lot of unsatisfying arguments, God shows up and speaks. The author pens the voice of God in these chapters with beauty, with creativity, and with brevity, of which I'm going to try to model all three of those this morning. I think it's important to remember that Job is poetry, which maybe means that it would be a great screenplay, and Hollywood should be paying attention and just making more movies out of Bible stories, because currently the screenplays in Hollywood have fallen a little flat. But also important to remember about poetry, it is that it is not historical writing and it is not technical writing. Poetry has its own purpose, and that purpose is to press us under the surface of things, to help us ask some questions that maybe we would avoid. The text begins with, "The Lord answered Job." But there's something really beautiful about how the Lord answers Job, but does not actually provide a single direct answer. Instead, God presents a litany of questions in these chapters that reframes Job's perspective, and my hope is that it reframes our perspective. We see God's response to Job reflected actually in the person of Jesus. It's important to remember that Jesus often responds to all the questions that he is asked with questions. And this is what we see with God to Job. God's questions to Job and Jesus' questions in the Gospels are always about reframing our reality. They're trying to press under the surface. They're trying to get us to look at some of the deeper realities that most of the time we do a great job of completely avoiding with all of our conjecture. So the name that the author uses of God here is Yahweh, which is very different than how God has been referred to in the first 37 chapters by Job and his friends. All along, Job and his friends have been using titles of God, never this personal name of God. But God responds to Job with this name, Yahweh, which is this idea of I am. It's the same way that God responded to Moses out of the burning bush. And the tone of the conversation has shifted about conjecture about God to an awesomely real encounter with God. God responds to Job, it says, out of the whirlwind. Or if you're more Shakespearean, you could appreciate that maybe the original language was the tempest, right? So the Jewish philosopher and author Martin Buber often described the difference between a theology about God and an encounter with God as the difference between reading a menu and sitting down for dinner. And so this is kind of what we experience with God calling Job to the table. It's kind of like God saying to Job, pull up to the table, son. We're going to have some dinner. And so the text that we jump into is this Job 38. And Job and his friends, and by proxy maybe all of humanity and for every century since, has questioned God about suffering. And so how does God respond? So I'd like to read this morning out of Job chapter 38, out of the version of the Message, because Eugene Peterson does such a beautiful job kind of capturing the poetic tone of Job chapter 38. And now finally God answered Job from the eye of the violent storm. He said, "Why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Pull yourself together, Job, up on your feet and stand tall. I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Where were you when I created the earth? Tell me, since you know so much, who decided on its size? Certainly you'll know that. Who came up with the blueprints and the measurements? How was the foundation poured, and who set the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang in chorus and the angels shouted out in praise, and who took charge of the ocean when it gushed forth like a baby from the womb? That was me. I wrapped it in soft clouds and tucked it in safely at night. Then I made a playpen for it, a strong playpen so it couldn't just run loose, and said, 'Stay here. This is your place. Your wild tantrums are confined to this place.'" Let me jump a few verses down to 19. God says, "Do you know where light comes from and where darkness lives, so that you could take them by the hand and lead them home when they get lost? Why, of course you know that. You've known them all of your life. You grew up in the same neighborhood with them." And God's questions continue. This poetry of God's litany of questions to Job begins with the creation of the universe, with the cosmos. He says, the earth, the sea, the sky, the sun, the night, day, weather, constellations. Job, surely you know where all of these came from. And in this brilliant way, I think that God talks about the sea, because he talks about it like an infant that he delivers and then he puts in a playpen. So for those of you with infants, God has a special place in his heart for you. But also it's important to remember that the ancient civilizations feared the sea. If there was any one image that would capture everything that they could not control, the sea was it. You can almost hold the Noah story as like a backdrop to the way that God's talking to Job about the sea. And if we're honest, even in our modern minds and in our current moment, we recognize that we cannot control the storms or the sea. And yet God uses this poetry to say, I delivered them like a baby, I wrapped them in the clouds, and then I put them behind the baby gate so that they wouldn't get hurt and they wouldn't hurt you. The poetry of God continues after he talks about the universe in 38 and 39, where he talks about all created beings. He has this list of both domestic and wild animals. He talks about the raven and the goat and the donkey and the ox and the ostrich and the hawk and the horse and the eagle. And what's conspicuously missing in God's kind of bragging about creation is human beings. Which maybe seems to God saying, by the way, it's not all about you. You are not the center of the universe, you boomer, buster, Xer, millennial, or Zer. The world and the universe doesn't actually all revolve around you. And in so doing, God's response of all these questions has expanded and maybe even exploded Job's construct. And then God begins with the blonde jokes. Well, actually, there's no blonde jokes. There's ostrich jokes. The ostrich, God seems to point out, is his great sense of humor about the beautiful but forgetful parts of his creation. So he says, consider the ostrich and its beauty, but it forgets where it places its eggs, which may be something like, consider the beautiful man or the beautiful woman who forgets where they put their keys. Just remember that God has a special place in his heart for beautiful and forgetful things. But God kind of continues, and he's just basically continuing to say to Job, there is so much that you have not taken into the equation. And then God ends his litany of questions with this direct question that I think hits Job right between the eyes. And he says, so what do you have to say for yourself? Are you going to correct me? Are you going to accuse me? So this dinner conversation did not go as Job had planned, because God's response to this question of suffering has been a brief history of the cosmos and has completely reframed the conversation and completely reframed Job's focus and his frustrations. All of Job's suffering and his questions and conjecture and complaints are no longer the center. They are not the focus. The cosmos and the creation are overwhelmingly expansive and beyond the comprehension of Job. And Job's response in Job 40, he says this: I'm speechless. I'm in awe. Words fail me. I will put my hand over my mouth because I've talked too much. I've talked way too much, and I will say no more. I think when we sit down across the table from God for dinner, and we're confronted with the mystery of creation and the cosmos, our response is often, I've talked too much. Now, I am chief of sinners of talking too much. This has been the way since my childhood. And ultimately, the text in many ways confronted my own heart about this issue. That I find myself too often giving too much conjecture rather than sitting in awe and mystery and wonder. I verbally process and probably more often than not would benefit from just using Job's words, which is, I've talked too much, I'm going to say no more. And I don't know that I'm alone in that in this moment in 2020. And so my question for you is, what are the conversations where you may recognize, I've talked a little too much? Where could the mystery and the wisdom and the wonder of God cause you to cover your mouth and listen? So Job is quiet, and now God repeats himself to Job, which again, every parent in the room could appreciate repeating himself. And what God says to Job, I think should be like a line that every parent should be able to begin every conversation with their child. Because God says this: brace yourself, pull yourself together, I will question you and you will answer me. So like parents, if you need like a good opening line for your conversations with your children, start with brace yourself, pull yourself together, I will question you and you will answer me. I think that's a great line. But this time, God asked Job a question, but I think this question is actually in direct response to Job's whole line of questioning about justice and suffering. Because God says this: do you presume to tell me I'm wrong? Will you condemn me so that you can be in the right? Or as Eugene says in the Message, are you calling me a sinner so that you can feel like a saint? And here comes the mic drop. God says to Job, I will gladly step aside. I will hand all things over to you because surely you could save yourself with no help from me. And at this point, it's not just the table that falls silent. It's the whole restaurant that is silent. Because there is a poetic silence about this concept. Because here, I believe, the book of Job echoes with beautiful poetry the whole story of Scripture. Because our Scriptures are about a story about a God who saves. From the garden to the cross to today. Our story is about a God who does not abandon us in the cosmos alone. And God's direct question to Job is a direct reminder of what reality would be like without his presence here with us. And he uses poetry to begin to help reshape our imagination about the mystery of suffering and this greater mystery, which is God, that is so beyond us. And God does this with two fantastic beasts and where to find them. Thank you. I believe that this is poetry not just for Job, but I believe that this is poetry for us to reimagine the suffering and the mystery of suffering and the mystery of God. And I could not be more excited to finally be giving a sermon after 25 years on Behemoth and Leviathan. So afford me just a few moments. Behemoth, the first fantastic beast that God explains, is this land creature that's often imagined as either maybe an elephant or a hippopotamus, or my personal favorite, the biggest dinosaur that your imagination could create. And it's described by God as this incredible creature of power and strength, but poise. And God says this is like the first of the works of God. And then God's question posed to Job about Behemoth, it says, could anyone capture or control him? Or again, in creatively words of the Message, you absolutely would not want him for a house pet. And then God expands and he talks about Leviathan, and Leviathan is the sea creature. And it's often imagined maybe as a giant crocodile or this deep sea creature, or my favorite, a sea dragon, or I think maybe just the Loch Ness Monster. And it's described as uncontrollable and uncontainable and completely beyond human effort or control. And the text says, any hope of subduing him is false. No one is fierce enough to even arouse him. Now, the question about the poetry in Job 40 and 41 about Behemoth and Leviathan is that God just creatively expanding on these two creatures for Job, that he's taken another lap around his creation because he wants Job and us just to consider how utterly powerful he is? That no one could control these fantastic beasts other than God? Is that what he's saying? I don't think so. I think that there's something poetic and subversive about this text that's trying to press under some of our questions about suffering and reality. The most compelling and creative understanding of this text that I found was based on the insights of a Jewish rabbi and philosopher, Harold Kushner. He offers that Behemoth and Leviathan are images of the moral world and the natural world. That we see in these two creatures all the power and all the possibility, but also all of the problems and all of the pains of our existence. That they are God's response to Job's question and ours about why is there suffering? Why is there pain? And it's through this subversive wisdom, because what God is saying to Job and to us is that these two creatures are so beyond us that we just have this small glimpse about the mysteries of the cosmos. And God is really clear that the only person who could alone rouse or control or stare down these two fantastic beasts is God alone. That Behemoth and Leviathan are examples for us about this expansive and generative chaos and cosmos that we find ourselves a part of that absolutely require a God of constant involvement and eternal interaction. And so the question that Job has asked about suffering, and that we continue to ask every day, is why is there suffering? And ultimately, I think our questions of suffering are held by this mystery of God's power and his goodness that's beyond what we could imagine or control. And our response then is one of awe and wonder and worship that he has not left us in this cosmos alone with these two painfully, powerfully creatures. I think what God is telling Job and what he's telling me and he's telling us is that we could never be in control of absolute control of the moral and natural world. And I think what he's saying is, aren't you glad that I didn't leave you alone? As I thought about this text over the last month, I considered the sufferings that we are experiencing in the moral and the natural world in 2020. If you were to pause for a moment, there may not be a year or a time period in recent history that it feels like both the moral world and the natural world are as much in chaos as they are right now. That if you were to go back and read the descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan, that might actually feel like a very good description of how this year has unfolded. And if we were to consider Behemoth as the moral world, that in our moral world there are aspects of suffering and there are injustice that we can't quite rein in. And I think what God is saying to Job and to us is the reason that we can't rein them in is because what you're trying to rein in is the human heart. And it's such a powerful creature, and it's so generative and creative. No one should confuse the human heart with a tameable house pet. No one can look into the eyes of another person and get them by just looking at them to bend to their will. God alone can look humanity straight in the eyes. So how do we begin to respond with a greater sense of awe to the suffering of the moral world? I think we begin with that God alone is sovereign over all. And we have to accept that God painfully allows both the oppressed and the oppressor to exist in his universe. And we also acknowledge that we have been both. And we should be wise and be cautious about all of our conjecture about how to housebreak other human hearts. The only one who has been able to shift the human heart is God, and he does so through the person of Jesus, and he did so through entering into the moral world and suffering with us. Jesus confronts injustice not with this physical or political power, but with the power alone to shift the human heart. And I think it's incredibly clear in the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus that those of us who would claim to follow the way of Jesus should serve those who suffer and show compassion to suffer alongside those that society has overlooked. And it seems to be Jesus is pressing under the surface to say he alone is going to change the human heart. It is our responsibility to move alongside and suffer with those who find themselves in these spaces. We'll consider Leviathan as the natural world. This natural world that specifically for us here with fires that burn, or those on the coasts with hurricanes that rage. God's saying to Job, you can't control this. You can't rein this in. There's stars and there's galaxies and there's forests and there's fires, and all of that exists in a universe that is so far beyond your control. Helpful wisdom from a Jewish rabbi says, stolen seeds grow as happily as honestly purchased ones do. Which means that the natural world does not have a conscience. Most of us are not upset about hurricanes that hit uninhabited islands. And so the problem then is that we need to be incredibly wise and cautious about our conjecture when the natural world runs into ours, which includes coronaviruses and pandemics. N.T. Wright, a theologian, wrote a book about God and the pandemic, about the current coronavirus. And he says, too often, Christians think that we should be able to see what he, speaking of God, is up to. But I don't really think that we're given that kind of access. There's a humility here that we need. Knowing all the details is, as the saying goes, above our pay grade. It's God's job. Our job, when God lets us know what we have to do in this particular situation, is to get on with it. Meaning our job is to move toward suffering. Our job is to steward and care for the natural world that's filled with all this beauty and mystery. And our job is to be the people of God that shows up where there is suffering. I think Paul echoes a lot of this in Acts chapter 17. He says, in him, we live and we move and we have our being. It is in this mystery of God that our existence is a part of. We are not the center of the universe. We are entering into the center of the cosmos, which is God. And so here's my encouragement, is this week find a couple of minutes to reflect on the chaos of the moral and the natural world. It shouldn't take you too long to have a few ideas come to mind. But as you begin to think about how chaotic the natural and the moral world are, pivot and begin to think about and have a posture of gratitude that we have not been left in the cosmos alone, that our existence and our suffering are all held within this greater mystery of God, and that God is present in this mystery. He is present to us. He is in and for and with us. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your ancient words that invite us to reconsider who we are and where we are and who you are. May our posture be one of gratitude and humility and worship. We pray this in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. Amen.